So today we're talking about euthanasia, which is topic 2.5 in the OCR A-level religious studies specification. So take a pause of the video to see these key terms and whether you can define them. Here are the definitions. So the sanctity of life is the idea that life is intrinsically sacred or has such a worth that is not considered within the power of a human being. And this is normally seen within the Christian tradition, but also other religions such as Judaism. Quality of life. This is a way of judging the extrinsic experience of life that affects or justified whether or not it is worth continuing life. Personhood is the quality of human life that makes it worthy, usually linked to a certain higher capacity. And voluntary euthanasia. This is when a person's life is ended painlessly by a third party at the person's own request. So this is where a lot of the examples of a lethal injection, for example, where people go to institutions in order to help them end their lives. Non-voluntary euthanasia is when a person is unable to express their wish to die, but there are reasonable grounds for ending their life painlessly. So, for example, if a person is in extreme pain. So, an example of this is something like if someone gets into a very severe car accident and they lose capacity to be able to live by their own, but they're plugged into a machine, a life support machine. They're most likely in very high pain, so it's the question of whether you switch the life support off or not. In non-voluntary euthanasia, this is where a person is killed against their wishes. So, for example, when a disabled person was killed by Nazi doctors during World War II, this is as they didn't want to die, yet they were euthanized. An act of euthanasia is a deliberate action performed by a third party to kill a person. So, for example, a lethal injection. And an act of euthanasia is illegal in the UK. However, if you're listening to this video after 2024, I'm not sure what the results will be. However, the UK government is now processing to see whether to make active euthanasia legal. So it might change by the time you listen to this video, so I would double check. And then we have non-treatment decision, and this is a decision medical professionals make to uphold or withdraw medical treatment or life support that is keeping the person alive because they are not going to get better, or because the person asked them to. So controversially, it's also called passive euthanasia. So a quick recap of what euthanasia is. It comes from the Greek word for a good death, or it can also be known as mercy killing, and it is a controversial issue raising questions of whether people should have the right to end their own lives or the lives of others at a time of their own choosing. So one of the main arguments against euthanasia is the sanctity of life. So people who believe in the sanctity of life believe that life is special, sacred and holy, and that it has an intrinsic worth. And often people who believe in the sanctity of life hold this belief for religious reasons, and they might believe that life is sacred because it is a gift from God and or because people are made in the image of God. And non-religious people might believe the human life is sacred because they have reason and free will. So because we have intrinsic value and because we are autonomous, rational beings, so, for example, have the reason to make our own choices. And that's why life is sacred for these people. And some people believe that all life is sacred, not only human life, so also animal life. And this is something where we'd look into something like Peter Singer as well. The example of the image at the bottom, you have the image of Michelangelo. So again, it's showing or illustrating God creating Adam. And this is another reason for why some religious believers would explain that life is sacred, because it is directly given from God. So the Bible can be used to support the view that human life has sanctity. So for example, God created mankind in his own image. This quote really illustrates that because we are made in the image of God, we should not be able to destroy our life, because God is the only person that gives life and can take it away. So the Bible can also be used to question ideas about the sanctity of life. So for example, on different occasions when God commands war. And the idea that life is sacred can be used as an argument against euthanasia on the grounds that no one has the right to take away human life. However, this leads to a slippery slope argument that can be used in the context of the sanctity of life, saying that once life is considered to be less than sacred, in some cases, it undermines all human dignity and allows people to be treated as disposable. So they say that if you allow euthanasia, it becomes a slippery slope of when is it taken too far. They might argue that if you allow euthanasia for terminally ill people, well, whereas the line of what if they get treated, for example, which is arguable, which is contradictory to people that know they're going to die because they have terminal cancer, for example. But they also might question, well, if someone is severely depressed, they might think that they're never going to get over it, but their condition, depression, is technically curable. So it opts for the question of, well, we want to protect people from making an irrational decision of ending their life because they just can't take it for now. So it can be argued that the sanctity of life is not an unbreakable moral rule, but that it can sometimes be moral to take life. So for example, killing someone who is murderously aggressive in order to save many lives, or sacrificing one's own life in order to save another life. So this can be illustrated in many different ways. So for example, you can use Bonhoeffer as one, sacrificing himself in order to save others in terms of helping Jews hide from Nazis. That could technically be seen as sacrificing yourself because there is a chance of you dying. Or it would be something like people that jump in front of guns being shot at other people in order to protect them, so they sacrifice themselves. And this is contrasted with the quality of life argument. So the quality of life is ideas about quality of life are often introduced into debates about euthanasia and sometimes as a counter-argument to sanctity of life beliefs. And the concept of quality of life involves considering how much enjoyment and fulfillment a person is getting given their state of physical and mental health, and it includes looking to the future and prognosis of their condition. So discussions about the quality of life consider whether life is worth living or whether bringing about death would be more preferable, for example, if someone's terminally ill. Another argument that some people argue is that if someone has a debilitating or painful terminal condition, then they should not be compelled to live until they die naturally. Quality of life is commonly considered in cases of animal welfare, where it is considered to many to be very cruel not to euthanize a suffering animal. So they argue it should be the same for a suffering human. So this raises issues about what personhood is. And so personhood is what makes a person a person. So it involves the question of what makes a living thing a person, and the issue is important because it is a living thing, is not a person. Perhaps it does not have the same rights, including the right to life, as many persons do. So with the example I gave, someone who has been in a very serious car accident and they no longer have the brain capacity because their brain was severely damaged, let's say, they might have the mental capacity of a vegetable. So therefore it's asking this idea of, are they even a person at that moment? Some people would say yes, because in order to be a person, the minimal thing you have to be is a human. So therefore they would always say that people have personhood. But maybe from a quality of life perspective, if we look at this image here, quality of life talks about, well, do they have mobility? Do they have friends and relationships? Do they have overall good health? Are there any symptoms that are really bad living with? Can they perform everyday tasks? Do they have a controlled level of anxiety and stress? So if it's too much, they might consider that they aren't living a good quality enough life and might not even have the personhood. If you can't move, for example, you might not have personhood for some people. So some argue that in order to be a person, there must be awareness of self and others and ability to interact with the world. And other people, like I said, say that in order to be a person, the only thing necessary is to be a human. So, others argue that other species as well as human beings should be considered as persons, or that personhood is a sliding scale rather than a strict either or distinction. It's kind of a spectrum. So personhood is usually linked to capacities and functions, and this raises issues about whether a fetus is a person, or whether someone with a severe brain functioning or animals such as primates might be persons as well. So again, it crosses over into abortion debates as well as euthanasia. So the question of potential is also an issue of personhood, so raising discussion of whether a living thing should be accorded dignity and rights because of what it has is clearly no potential for higher level function. So now on to voluntary euthanasia. This comes from the ancient Greek Hippocratic Oath, which still informs medical standards for today. So doctors have to oblige to do good and avoid evil, and they take an oath in order to save lives. So that's one of the important functions of a doctor. And some people argue that euthanasia goes against a doctor's oath to protect and save lives. So voluntary euthanasia is when a patient's life is ended at their own request, and it is illegal in the UK, but is legal in some other countries such as the Netherlands, Canada, Belgium, Luxembourg, and I think Spain and Portugal. But again, like I said earlier, currently, and I'm in December 2024 at the moment, the government is looking at a bill in order to legalise euthanasia. But again, it might pass, it might not pass. So it might be legal or not legal depending on the time you watch this video. So it's often the focus for legal challenges when people in very difficult circumstances challenge the law and ask that someone should be allowed to help them to die without fear of prosecution. There is a case of a man who had terminal cancer who went to the Netherlands to have euthanasia, and when she came back, when his wife came back from helping him, she was prosecuted in the UK from helping him die. So again, that really illustrates the idea that it was seen as helping someone kill themselves. But a lot of the time there are arguments of, well, it's very ableist because a fully, an able-bodied, let's say, person can take their own lives at any moment. So it's kind of arguing what's the difference of suicide of a person rationally taking their own life and a terminally ill person deciding to end their life because they're in so much pain. There is that question there that some people use as an argument for euthanasia. And Jonathan Glover discusses the issue in his book Causing Death and Saving Lives in 1977. And a key argument in favour of voluntary euthanasia is that people should have the right to avoid pain and should be able to choose a gentle, painless death as long as the decision is made rationally, so mercy killing, as euthanasia is known as. And some people argue in favour of voluntary euthanasia because suicide is an option for able-bodied people, like I said, and it is discriminatory not to allow it for disabled people. So some people argue against voluntary euthanasia because the person might change their mind when they are no longer able to continue. And some argue that allowing voluntary euthanasia will encourage unscrupulous people to put pressure on sick relatives to end their lives when it was not what they wanted, in order to them possibly get a large sum of money if they have large life insurance. That is also a risk or a possibility of people that they do take and exploit their family members. The slippery slope argument is the view that if someone is allowed in exceptional circumstances, it begins a process which becomes impossible to stop and the situation will get out of hand. So some people argue that it puts doctors and other health professionals in an impossible position because of the oath that doctors take. And this is just an illustration of what different euthanasias are, that you can just visually see it. So more about non-voluntary euthanasia. So this is when there is euthanasia without the request of the patient. It could happen in cases of severe brain damage, or when a baby is born with multiple problems, or when someone is incapable of communication. And debates arise when there are cases of people who cannot communicate and who seem to be permanently incapable of functioning in ways that might give them an acceptable quality of life. And medical science has progressed to the extent that people with severe loss of brain function can be kept alive artificially for a long time. And this gives a different question, because it asks, if this person was left in natural circumstances, they would have been already dead. So for a lot of religious believers, it might be more permissible to have non-voluntary euthanasia, so like the switching off of a life support machine, because they would have already been dead if it wasn't for the aid of medical progression. But others then argue, well, God has allowed us for the opportunity to have medical progression, and therefore keeping them alive is a necessity, rather than switching it off and allowing them to die. So some people write living wills to clarify their wishes, and if they should become brain damaged and incapable of communicating. Some argue that non-voluntary euthanasia is the most compassionate course of action when there is no prospect of the patient having an acceptable standard of brain function. Others argue that it is not for us to decide what is an acceptance, that there is never a point where medical professionals can be totally certain that there is no hope of improvement. And a distinction is often made between deliberate active euthanasia, so doing something to bring about death, and then non-treatment decision, so for example the removal of extraordinary treatments, so such as performing a surgical operation that has very little chance of success. However, people do not agree about what kinds of treatment might be considered extraordinary. So now we're going to look into what different ethical theories say about euthanasia, and we're going to start with natural moral law and Aquinas. So if you remember what Aquinas talks about, he has 5 precepts, and one of them is to preserve life. So that should already give you an idea of what he's going to say. So in natural law ethics, an action is morally good if it accords with eternal law, divine law, natural law, and human law. And there is a primary precept to do good and avoid evil, and a primary precept to preserve life, like I just said. So human life is considered to be a sacred gift from God, and divine law teaches in the Bible that God creates each individual in his own image. So really looking at the sanctity of life argument here. So natural law ethics, or natural moral law, has been very influential on Catholic teaching, which says that euthanasia is wrong. So it considered the precept of preserving life very strongly, and therefore would not support euthanasia. You can look at the double effect theory possibly and see if the intention is to, for example, end suffering. Then they might allow for a drug, for example, to be used to end that suffering or pain, reduce the pain. But the side effect, the unwanted side effect, might be a quicker death. That might be the way that they would accept it, through a double effect standard. But euthanasia is not an apparent good for Aquinas, and it seems to offer a good outcome but is not a real good. Natural law ethics are absolutists, so they do not make exceptions for different circumstances or different likely outcomes. And there is no obligation under natural law for people to go to great lengths to keep someone alive when the treatment offered is burdensome and not meaningful. So they would allow something like the switching off the life support. And like I said, the doctrine of double effect could be used in some end-of-life care, where the treatment offered to relieve someone's pain might have the double effect of shortening life. So the intention is not to kill, and this is a really important thing, because in euthanasia the intention is death. But for natural moral law, if the intention is not to kill but relieve pain, it wouldn't be seen as wrong and therefore permissible. So it could be argued that if the patient is so deliberated that they lack all the higher functions such as reason associated with personhood, then the rules about how persons should be treated might not apply. And then these are the possible advantages and disadvantages of a natural law approach to euthanasia. So the first one is it gives clear guidance that there is no doubt about what to do and what not to do. You know very easily what to do because it tells you the strict rules. It respects religious beliefs about the sanctity of life. It does not leave people vulnerable to scrupulous relatives who might wish to benefit from their deaths. And it completely avoids the slippery slope argument where human dignity becomes less important over time. However, there are disadvantages, so it can be seen as unsympathetic to people in vast pain or with no quality of life. And medical advantages make it difficult to judge whether some kind of treatment should be regarded as burdensome or extraordinary. So life support, for example, is both common and extraordinary, as there are many resuscitation techniques. And now we're going to move on to situation ethics. So Fletcher was the leading advocate of situation ethics, and he wrote the book Situation Ethics, and he was in favour of legalised of euthanasia, and he became president of the Euthanasia Society of America. So because situation ethics rejects absolute rules, and so it rejects an absolute ban on euthanasia, he thought that the most ethical thing to do was to take account for each individual's personal situation, as long as it applies to agape love. And Fletcher saw that in some situations, the most loving thing to do was to allow euthanasia. So it advocates for applying the rule of love, and the ethical thing to do is whatever will bring about the most loving consequence. So euthanasia can be justified if it will bring about the most loving outcome for the patient and their family and friends. So Fletcher thought that the quality of life was more important than the sanctity of life, and he thought life was not worth living if the patient did not have some basic functions, such as a minimal intelligence, self-awareness, ability to judge the passage of time, for example. So that's why he really advocated for legalising euthanasia. There are advantages and disadvantages. So the first one is that it could be seen as far more compassionate in individual situations than a blanket ban on euthanasia, recognising that many people would like to have this option available to them. It would be seen as a less discriminatory way or attitude towards disabled people. Like I said earlier, the able-bodied people are allowed to, or can perform or kill themselves in suicide, whilst disabled people can't a lot of the time. It places greater emphasis on human autonomy, so decision making and being able to choose for yourself. Can be criticised as not giving recognition to the sacred nature of human life, however. And the most loving course of action is not always easy to identify. So some people might criticise that it might appear that the most loving thing to do is to allow euthanasia, but it might actually not be. And allowing euthanasia on a case-by-case basis makes legalisations very difficult. So legalising euthanasia might create a slippery slope where people are euthanized when it might not be what they really wanted, or might have a chance of recovery. There's also utilitarianism, and within utilitarianism, because the principle is the greatest happiness for the greatest number, it would allow euthanasia if it brought about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. However, with utilitarianism, especially act utilitarianism, it would justify something like Nazis euthanizing disabled people, which is obviously a really big problem, because it's looking at minorities and majorities, and the majority view in act utilitarianism takes over or prioritizes over the minorities. So rule utilitarianism would probably set aside some rules that show greatest happiness for the general of society. So it would protect minorities with the harm principle, so harming if any that prevents any harm being caused to any individual. So that may be a better way to apply it. But again, if it causes greatest happiness for the greatest number in a situation, it would allow euthanasia. So more similar to situation ethics, but through a non-religious perspective. It's time for some exam practice, because practice makes perfect. So here you have your AO1 knowledge. So if you can answer all of these questions, then you know all of your AO1 knowledge for this topic. And now we're going to look at some exam questions and how to go about answering them. So for this question, natural law provides excellent moral guidance for people making decisions about euthanasia. Your AO1 will be to illustrate knowledge and understanding through the use of some of the following ideas that I'm going to go over. So, for example, a description and explanation of the main features of natural law, including its moral absolutism, its basics in the thinking of Aquinas. So you'd have to understand and outline what Aquinas believed with natural moral law, based on Aristotelian ideas about eudaimonia and its influence on the ethical teaching of the Catholic Church. You describe and explain the primary precepts of natural law, especially the precept of the preservation of life, with examples. Describe and explain the idea of sanctity of human life and its basis in Catholic teaching or Christian teaching as well. So you can give quotes of people being made in the image of God. You can describe and explain euthanasia as an issue and showing the differences between voluntary and involuntary and non-voluntary euthanasia, and ideas about autonomy, because that was also very important to Aquinas. And you can describe and explain the views that support, criticise or offer an alternative to natural moral law in relation to euthanasia. So that could be situation ethics, for example. And with your AO2 knowledge, you have to really demonstrate the critical evaluation, analysis and coherent argument through the use of some of these things that I'm going to go through now. So you might want to agree that natural moral law provides excellent moral guidance for people making decisions. And to do that, you can provide a clear guidance in emphasising the sanctity of life and the need to preserve it. And again, having illustrations, you can go through that through the double effect theory, which can prevent decisions based on natural law from becoming too cruel and leaving people to suffer because of the examples that I've given you. It can give it gives firm guidance, you can talk about that, and it removes the responsibility from relatives and medical professionals for having to make very difficult and painful decisions at times when emotions are running high. It's in forbidding euthanasia, the dangers of misdiagnosis or unnecessary pessimistic diagnoses are also avoided. In forbidding euthanasia, also, the possibility of a miraculous cure remains a possibility, and for that you can give examples of people going to Lourdes in France, where people who have terminal illnesses have gone and have been cured. Not all of them, I think there's only 80 recorded cases where 3 doctors have to agree that there was no scientific explanation for people being cured. That's an example if you can give some miracles if you wanted to do that. Natural law ethics also protects vulnerable people from being exploited and pushed towards euthanasia when it's not what they really wanted. So those are some arguments for. Now, arguments against natural moral law, you can talk about people might be regarded as having the right to autonomy over their own lives. You can talk about how natural law ethics can be seen as cruelly prolonging suffering against the patient's best interests. Each person's situation is different, and an absolutist ethic doesn't take this into account at all. Natural law ethics was formulated in the 13th century, and medicine has moved on significantly then. And you can talk about how natural moral law is based on a belief in God and in the sanctity of human life, but not everyone shares that belief. You can also talk about the quality of life argument here. And then obviously conclude at the end. And now for this question, how convincing is the claim that decisions about euthanasia should be made according to the principles of situation ethics? In your AO1, you can describe and explain euthanasia as an issue, perhaps outlining voluntary and involuntary and non-voluntary euthanasia as ideas and ideas about autonomy. You can describe and explain key features and principles of situation ethics, and really focusing on Joseph Fletcher and the concept of agape love and the other aspects of the 6 propositions. A lot of the time you can also give examples of Jesus and how agape love is focused on that. You can talk about Jesus putting people before the law, so for example healing on the Sabbath. You can also describe and explain the views of some supporters and critics of situation ethics and some alternatives to situation ethics, so for example natural moral law or utilitarianism. With the AO2 knowledge for here, you can again show critical evaluation of this. So always give your arguments, what the strengths and what the weaknesses might be of all of these claims within both essays. So you might want to argue in support of situation ethics. Here you could look at situation ethics as each situation individually and allows for a consideration of different circumstances. You can give some examples of different circumstances where one instance is allowed of euthanasia and one where it's not. The principle of agape can be extended to everyone involved, such as family members and nurses, as well as the patient. You can talk about how situation ethics allows patients to have autonomy over their own lives. And you might also compare it with another ethical system that you find less persuasive, such as, I don't know, if you want to argue against natural moral law. And in terms of arguing against situation ethics, you can talk about that it doesn't give a high priority to the principle of the sanctity of life as much as natural moral law. It treats each individual situation according to its own circumstances, and it makes legalization very difficult. You can give examples of that as well. And with situation ethics, there is the possibility of vulnerable patients being exploited in euthanasia as an option. Again, give example of relatives possibly exploiting their family members. And it's not always easy to know what the most loving course of action might be. So euthanasia does not allow for a change of mind, and if the decision turned out to be the wrong one. So those are just some aspects that you could talk about in these questions, but you can always add your own theories and examples and strengths and weaknesses of both of these topics and theories, ethical theories towards euthanasia. So thanks for joining me for today's lesson on euthanasia. Join me next time for more philosophy, theology, and ethics.